morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the first of the New York Spring Coffee Talks. We're so delighted to have you here this morning for this star-studded panel. I would first like to say a word about TEFAF Coffee Talks and what we're trying to do with this. It's an idea I borrowed from the Edinburgh Book Festival, which I hope they won't begrudge me, so that the idea is that every morning at 10:30 a.m. in this space, you know reliably that you can come here for great conversation and dialogue. So it's informal, of course. Guests are sitting here on stools close to you, and we expect that this is going to be a terrific and wonderful conversation and debate possibly today. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, and she will take it from there. Carrie Barrett, Deputy Director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and I think this will be a lot of fun. The topic that we chose today, which is so broad, is really museums and social action. And as I've spoken informally to each of our panelists, that can mean so many different things in museums, large and small. It means visitor experience, it means visitor engagement, it means the kinds of things that people do in museums. I think more than that, sort of more intellectually and more socially promising, I think a lot about how the role of museums can be an influencer in society. Not only what we think a lot in museums, at the Met, and I think in other places too, about how we get more people in our doors, how we teach people more about the arts, how we allow people who may not have the experience of a family who taught them to go to museums when they were little, that the experience of art can be wonderful, healing, can be a call to action. And I'll start there, so I don't want my talk to be so long. I was saying that one of the things that I think about, I was telling Timothy this morning, is an episode at the Met. This is about social relevance, inclusiveness, and actually our nimbleness or lack thereof to be responsive to the times, to the election. Now it seems like a long time ago, but we felt really badly that we couldn't turn on a dime and do something the day after the Charlie Hebdo kind of disaster. Why couldn't we respond? And we had, within the past several weeks, I guess it is, when the immigration ban came out, our ancient Near East curators just decided, it sounds so renegade, but not really, these are really nice people and scholars, just decided that Friday afternoon that they would go and stand in their galleries and talk. Our head of education didn't know what was going on. Our security guards got a little bit upset. Something might happen. And you know what? Nothing happened, because they talked about their authority of the objects. They talked about cultural heritage. They talked about the Met's place as a place of both solace, healing, beauty, a place that was a protection of the works of the cultures that had been named in that ban. And we have then got it incorporated into a Friday night schedule. It's now part of the schedule of Met Fridays. But if they hadn't just walked out of their offices and went into the galleries, I have to say, that would have taken us months to, well, do we have funding for it, and how can we do it, and who's going to do it, and what time will it be, and do we need to put it on a schedule or on the calendar? So that's just sort of one example of, I think, about how nimble can we be. I hope my friends here, my colleagues, will be able to talk a little bit about examples on their own. So without further ado from me, wide-ranging topic, I'd like to introduce Richard Armstrong, who's the director of the Guggenheim Museum and Foundation since 2008, leading really a global network of international legacy and leverage for the arts, both in New York City and as far away as Abu Dhabi and Venice and all over the world. Adam Weinberg, who's here just to my left, who's the Alice Pratt Brown Director of the Whitney Museum since 2003, overseeing just transformational exhibitions, collections growth, phenomenal, and not least of which is involved with the spectacular, still new building down in the Meatpacking District, which even the move to that neighborhood, I think, was...
Not sure when it becomes old, but
hopefully not. And we were saying just over coffee a minute ago that one of my favorite things about the Whitney, I hope that Adam talks a little about relevance and the biennial, if we can go there a little bit, and how challenging works of art still can provide an inclusiveness. It doesn't all have to be pretty and beautiful and oh so welcoming. Museums have to be able to challenge. But one of my favorite things are those chairs, you know, where people can sit and just read the newspaper looking over the river. And so you don't even have to go in the Whitney to become part of that social experiment. Kaywin Feldman from the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Niven and Duncan Macmillan Director and President since 2008, who has really strengthened her institution's national presence through major exhibitions, collections growth, reinstallation of your African galleries, which is truly significant, and then a really broad range of programs that have delved into the communities around Minneapolis with a growing, increasing attendance. Attendance has never, ever been higher. I'm jealous because the Minneapolis Institute is free. It's another challenge, but we could talk about admissions policies. And Timothy Rubb, the George D. Widner Director and CEO of the Philadelphia Museum of Art since 2009, also bringing a real vital energy and community spirit to Philadelphia and the surrounds, currently engaged, just broken ground on a new building project, which has got to be about collections growth and visitor engagement. So what I had set this up for just a few minutes, really briefly, I want to ask maybe each of you, starting with Richard perhaps, just a few minutes on this topic, thoughts that come to mind, a story you might want to tell, and then I really want to turn this into a conversation for the most part.
Do we need these? Yes, we do. Okay. I think I have an advantage because our building from its first day was set up to be a social experiment. So Wright understood it as a kind of collision or a pass-by with the art object and the person. And I think over the last 25 years in particular, the designers and the curators have figured out a way to exploit that in a very synthetic and seamless way. And I think we have a huge advantage in having a building that's, you know, fully activated. So in terms of sociability, I think it's an unusual place for that. And of course, we put efforts in other things as well.
Adam, how about you?
Well, it's interesting, Richard, that you start with the building and where you begin, because I always think it actually, in our case, always starts with Mrs. Whitney herself. She was an artist. The museum actually really began in her studio 20 years before she opened the museum. So it was about social engagement from the beginning. And one of the things that she said, which I always think about, is that it's so much easier to let others think for you than to think for yourself. And I think that that was the impetus for the museum in many ways, because here was an artist who was often supporting art that was nothing like the art that she made. She was making this Beaux-Arts sculpture. She ended up supporting abstract artists. One of the artists she most supported during her lifetime was Stuart Davis. I mean, Stuart Davis was a real lefty. She was a Republican, although a different kind of Republican than they are now. But it was but the idea that was to support the democracy of what American art was, even from the very, very beginning.
Carrie, as you mentioned, we're free at MIA, and being accessible is sort of the number one value, the number one thing that we care about at the museum. And all of our labels, our staff at the front of house, everybody reflects that idea of how to make the museum accessible. And tied to that is this idea of social action and relevance. And I do think that relevance is on the spectrum of social action, but perhaps not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And the social action piece has been really the hardest for us to navigate. And I was struck that when Philando Castile was shot just outside of St. Paul, our whole team sort of came together and said, what do we do? What's our role? What's our responsibility? But the hardest part was what's authentic, because everything we do, we feel really needs to come out of the collection, out of our mission. And we just didn't have the right response. And so that's been something that we've really been struggling with. After the Muslim immigration ban, we also came together and said, you know, what's our response to this? And we actually bought the largest billboard in town, the one that's right over First Ave where Prince played. And our billboard says, we're free, we're open to everyone, always. And that was an authentic response and felt right, and also felt like it was really part of our brand.
Did more people come?
I have no idea.
like to measure everything.
Yeah, that's true.
That was an authentic response.
Yes.
So again, I'm at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and shortly after I was appointed director in 2009, I was invited down to a similar kind of panel discussion in Miami, Art Basel. And at the end of that conversation, which included a lot of new directors, we were each asked what was foremost on our mind as we took on our new responsibilities. And my answer was that above all, I thought of the Philadelphia Museum of Art as a civic institution. And I've been thinking about the singular role that it had played in the community over the course of its history, founded in 1876, and how we think about our civic responsibility at a place like the PMA changes over time. Because the role of museums changed and what they do changes, of course, but also we're facing always changing circumstances in our own community. So that became in turn part of our strategic plan, one of the core objectives. Different from audience development, different from many other things, activating the collection and so on. But that's allowed me to ask our staff and our trustees over the last 7 years, what does our civic responsibility mean in this place and at this time, and what does civic engagement for an institution like ours mean? And we've answered that in various ways, and I could speak about that later, but let me just end with a question that was on my mind then and is still on my mind, and that it relates to social action or the answer to social action and how we implement it being rooted in a collection. I've asked most often, how do we turn this into curatorial and programmatic action, because that's really at the heart of the institution. And when Carrie called and asked me to serve on this panel, I said to myself, well, this is timely because we've just started a project, which actually we started it 3 years ago, but we've just unveiled it, called Philadelphia Assembled, which is something we've been doing in collaboration with a Dutch artist, Jeanne van Heeswijk, who is a practitioner of what's called social practice. And that's, I'll describe it in detail later if I have a moment, but it's really required us to sit down and work with a number of communities who hitherto have really had no access to the museum and no invitation. Both there and also later this fall in the museum, where we're going to give over a significant amount of space to their activities and present them to the community. This is completely new territory for us, and you'll have to come and see how it turns out.
That's amazing. So I want to, activating collections is something that I want to touch on. It's like you tipped me off here. And so that we don't lose time, and I want to talk about art and how I could turn to both of you first, because you work in encyclopedic museums, and I'm really interested in how the historic context of modern and contemporary art influences what you do in terms of how the impact that you make on visitors, and then maybe turning to the question of what's modern, how are things relevant, get to the question of the biennial, and things like that. So maybe if you want to start, just... Sure.
We'll turn to those of you not lucky enough to work in an encyclopedic museum. We like to play with our collections, and so we have very fluid boundaries between our curatorial departments, and so we frequently install perhaps a contemporary work in a historic setting, which I love because visitors really stop. If for no other reason, they stop because they know that we've done something different and they want to figure out what we were thinking. And so they immediately notice when something is contemporary. I had a really interesting experience where we hung a Kehinde Wiley in our Baroque galleries, and it's a very large Kehinde Wiley, and we also put out a comment book, and as I reviewed the comments, I was struck that a lot of people wrote that the Kehinde Wiley didn't belong in the Baroque gallery because the Kehinde Wiley is a very spiritual picture. And every painting in the Baroque gallery is religious. And I realized that there's a difference between spiritual and religious, but still. And for me, it was a reminder of how much work we have to do bridging the gap of a 21st century audience. But I would also say that one other technique that we use, we actually have a standing meeting every Wednesday for 20 minutes. And we have a core team that always comes, and then anybody's invited. And the meeting is called Newsroom, and our team talks about news that is trending locally, nationally, and internationally. And then we talk about what are the connections across the collection. Is there an installation? Is there a new interpretation of a label? Is it social media? Just all the ways that we can use this great collection. And they range from the playful. A couple of years ago when we realized that there was a royal baby on the way, we found that we had a Art Deco pram in the collection, so we put some AstroTurf down and put the pram out with a label. So it ranges from that to much more political and challenging work, which we're finding is making us more part of a community dialogue that is sometimes dark and difficult, but something we're committed to doing.
So how about that biennial and how you make that? You said it's, reconfiguring what biennial. No, it's important, and sort of, I think I've read some comments that you've made about how we're shaping what America looks like through the kinds of artists that you represent, the selections. Some of it's beautiful and some of it's really difficult.
So long, it's obviously, I can take everybody's time the entire time, and actually it's great because Richard Armstrong is the victim of many a biennial himself.
That's right.
But I think a couple of things just before I get to the biennial itself and how it relates. First of all, one of the impetus for moving downtown was to have more of our collection on view, and not just for the purpose of having it on view so people give us more. That's always nice. But it was to provide a context for what happens in the biennial, because in the past, as Richard knows very well, you take down almost the entire museum, put up the biennial, and people had no sense that it was a Kunsthalle where things were changing all the time. So the exhibition of the biennial in relationship to what's on view in the collection is really, really critical, because it's a way of grounding what we're doing. There's an exhibition for the collection called Where We Are that just opened, which is up at the same time, which really is about American values, American history, American culture. And Where We Are comes from the title of an Auden poem about 1939. So it actually has a kind of political backdrop to it, but includes many of the masterworks as well as unknown. In terms of the biennial itself, the biennial is an exhibition that takes the temperature of the times. And in the early days, there was some kind of a belief that one could be comprehensive in doing an exhibition and trying to show all the different tendencies.
Thanks.
Is that better? No. Okay. So what I was going to say is that there was the belief that the biennial could provide a comprehensive view of American art at any given time. We know that whatever is done has to be selective, even then, but even more so today with the number of artists. The biennial, at this moment, it has a lot of political work to it that is overtly political. It has work that is not overtly political, and I'd say it has work that is not directly political. I would probably argue that all art that is really interesting has a political function anyway, because it's upending how we see things and experience things, and even if it's in visual terms, it's setting new paradigms for how we see the world, how we think about ourselves. This biennial has had lots of lightning rod moments and works, particularly the Dana Schutz painting that was there, which has been actually a really, really interesting conversation. I don't want to go to it in great length, but just to say that we felt that it was really important to not, as I don't know who I said it first, but never to waste a good crisis. And I think that it's important when issues come up. That's what the Whitney has always done. It's been a platform for argument, for discussion. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times. There were 10 different articles about the biennial, many of them having to do with the Dana Schutz, but many of them having to do with notions of representation. What I really loved is it was the center of conversation about what was going on culturally. Not always easy, I can tell you, because in many ways the institution felt on some level that maybe we were being attacked, but I kept saying to the staff, that's not what it is. This is us putting up work. It's the artists expressing themselves. We're providing the context, and we have to be there for discussion and give and take. And that's the purpose of the Whitney from the very beginning. I mean, we have images of all the protests that have taken place at the Whitney since the beginning, and it's amazing. And you have everybody from Mark Rothko on one side who felt that we were held hostage to representation, to these great letters from Edward Hopper saying that we were held hostage to abstraction, to the African American artists in the '60s when we were doing some of our great pioneering shows of African American artists, where there were African American artists who felt that we were not doing it in the right way and shouldn't. And so I think all of that is part of the dialogue. It's part of where we are right now, and not always easy, but I think the important thing is to just connect with it. We don't shut down protests in any way, as long as nobody is. In fact, there's one tonight if you want to come to the museum. That is, we have one of the groups in the biennials called Occupy Museums, and I got an email last night saying they are planning to do a talk-in on spontaneously. Not so spontaneously, but they've called for people to come to the museum and use the galleries as a way to talk about the role of the artists right now and the fact that artists are having trouble supporting themselves, and particularly in face of the economic situation. So, more to come.
Richard, the Guggenheim is a place for that kind of dialogue and conversation, too. I'd say, I'm thinking, we had, on Monday night when the Costume Institute benefit, that naked guy in the glass box showed up. Do you know about this?
I've heard something about a naked guy.
But it's the kind of thing that it's very, very interesting. You do become a place of controversy when you least expect it. But the Guggenheim kind of thrives on that too, right? In some ways. Well, and global. And I want to make sure that we say something about, you're the one museum that has branches where you're dealing with not just New York City and modern and contemporary art, but really the whole world and the complexities of
Let me say one thing that's, I think, fundamental, and I might be on a slightly different wavelength from my colleagues who are more socially involved, but I think our responsibility as we define it is to identify the museum with artist. And when we feel strongly about an artist, we go with that artist as far as we can. And that's how we make our decisions. So,
it's the same for us.
Yeah, we don't have meetings about current events.
But John Chamberlain, Agnes Martin, shows that really do delight, surprise, engage, and your museum's always filled with people.
I mean, I might argue that we have probably a slightly different sense of history. So we had a conscious decision to look at what wars had done to creativity. So we looked at futurism. We looked at Gutai, which would be Japan after World War II. We looked at Zero, which was Germany, Holland, and the Low Countries after World War II. We looked at Ankawara, which was Japan after World War II. We looked at Buri, which was Italy after World War II.
Great.
Now we're done with wars. So,
At least for now.
I feel like, and I think our curators do as well, that museum lends itself well to articulating a slice of creative history. And we try and integrate social history into that, but we think our principal obligation is to foreground art, sometimes the artist as well, and then to help people understand that the crises that we're going through today are not unlike other ones that have happened previously.
And that practice is also how you define what you do in your other sites as well, right?
It's a little different because in Bilbao and in Venice both, we're very heavily dominated by foreign tourists who want to see, in one case, a building, and in another case, a peak of a life of an eccentric collector. So they're a little less...
Because it's your permanent collection that's in
those
those
places. Well, there
places.
are temporary exhibitions at both places, but it's a little more of relevance isn't such an issue there. And also we have to admit that the preoccupations of Europe are not our preoccupations.
But you also have contemporary shows now, like the Middle East series that you've been doing, which play off of those historical, which are very much about the present moment.
Indeed, but we felt like our obligation was to stop being rhetorically global and to be physically and intellectually global. So through the help of some donors, we've been able to add to the collection, examine other people's cultures, treat it with some respect, and hope that there's an ongoing dialogue and exchange.
Right. Timothy, can tell your thinking, your thoughts about this?
Well, I want to come back to your question about how museums with larger collections, even though we're not entirely encyclopedic, deal with this question. And I'm fond of saying in Philadelphia that our job, particularly with our historic collections, is to bring the past into conversation with the present. And invariably that leads you to different modes of interpretation of things that have been in the galleries and in certain relationships with other things for a very long time. And I think that's always an interesting question to prompt your curators and educators to think about. It foregrounds issues, of course, as it should, that are on people's minds today, whether it's power, expressions of power, or gender, privilege, that kind of thing. And bringing the works we're familiar with again to life, but in a very different light, is really what we should fundamentally do with those kinds of collections. To come at this from a slightly different way, I don't think there's been a time, at least during my years as director, where the political and the social, and I guess I should add the cultural to this, have been so conflated. So every move we make, every choice of exhibition or reinstallation, I think has more of a political cast today than it has before. And I was reminded of this last year when we put on two exhibitions, one which we organized with the Walker, called IPOP, International Pop, and the second, a big survey of Mexican modernism this past fall. And I was surprised, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, that they resonated in an extraordinary way with the public, precisely because they dealt with issues of the moment, of conflict, of different political ideologies, of the role of artists in shaping new societies, and of course that's a central theme to Mexican modernism. And they were much, much more popular and much more exciting to our audiences in Philadelphia than I think our staff ever imagined them to be. And it's allowed us to kind of move, I think, or given us permission now to move in a new direction, in a much more elastic one as we think about our exhibitions programs and what will engage audiences today.
Can I jump in?
Sure, go ahead.
Richard, I appreciate your point that your work is to let the artists speak. We have that different challenge where the artists have been dead for centuries, so not all of them, but so we have to do the speaking for them, and that's very different. And so much of the ways that our galleries are interpreted speak to just one view of the past that may or may not be interesting or relevant to a current population. And one of the experimentations that we're doing at MIA right now is we were one of the first museums in America to have period rooms. So we have almost 20 period rooms across the institution. And we have this lore across the museum where you bring up the period rooms and everyone goes, oh, everybody loves the period rooms. But again, there's no data behind everybody loving the period rooms. And, and they're very frozen in time, and they're all of them across a spectrum of historical veracity. And so we decided they're like theater sets, so let's use them that way. And so we've been embarking on a couple of years of experimentation in these rooms. And we actually have these two rooms from the late 1700s in Charleston, a dining room and a sitting room. And they've always been installed with furniture representing what we think somebody from Charleston, so the furniture's not from the rooms themselves, what they might have used. And you stand back behind the barrier and look at the ways that the rooms were used according to our interpretation. In our research, we've discovered new information about the man, Colonel John Stewart, who owned these rooms, and that he owned some plantations with large numbers of enslaved Americans. He also was the commissioner for Indian Affairs for the British Crown. And so we've thought about how do we look at these rooms differently, knowing that information? And so, and we've also discovered that he fathered a whole family with a Native American woman, and one of his descendants actually lives in Minnesota. And so we've installed in the gallery a video of her talking, some additional information about him, about the Cherokee. And then in the dining room, we've actually installed objects relating to African and African American agriculture and cooking, and so using the room that was about food, but to stimulate new ideas. It's a 6-month installation, so after that we can do something completely different, but just helping visitors to see these objects, these rooms from a new light.
Do you do that, or any of you do that? I'm thinking of almost like an artist intervention, because sometimes it's hard to get, I'd say, traditional curators or educators to do that kind of work, to back away from, we say there's layers of information. And there might be, maybe you're lucky, there must be somebody in your institution who still wants to tell the story of John Stewart and that room and what, life as it was. But to sort of break away from that in a way sometimes takes almost an intervention.
Absolutely.
From a contemporary artist. I think about, it's Fred Wilson.
It's interesting, and they don't want me to talk. But no, I was just going to say, in terms of interventions, it's one thing to ask artists to do an intervention. We had 2 different interventions that came about after the election. One was a piece by Annette Lemieux, and a piece, I think it was from the 90s, of placards with raised fists. And the piece is called Left, Right. And it's this whole idea about who has power, what's on the left, what's on the right. And she got in touch with us and asked that we install it with the placards facing down, with the fists facing down, which we did do in response because she felt that was part of her piece and reaction. Which is interesting that artists are now coming to us, and it could get pretty complicated if they start, asking things that become much more difficult to do. But Byron Kim, who had produced a work from the '93 biennial that had to do with colors of skin tones of different people, he actually asked if he could set up in the galleries and add to these portraits of skin tones of visitors in the galleries itself. And so, there are those interventions one requests, but then there are the interventions that just,
Can I ask a question? You just reminded me of something that I'm particularly interested in. Is I think as museums, part of the way we've always felt historically, I've worked at the Met a long time, to engage is that we tell. We have so much to tell, we're going to tell. But then there's this divide between what we have to tell and what visitors want to know. And then, and it may be that what they want to know is not right for us. There is this funny sort of gray area where you still want to be authentic and authoritative and have a little gravitas, because that's also why people come.
We find that people really want us to listen right now. That's one of the things that came up around the Danish Schutz. We've been doing, for example, I don't know, many of you may know that on January 20th, Inauguration Day, there were a group of artists who asked, actually in many cases demanded, that all museums be closed in response to the election of the president. And we very quickly actually took the stance quite the contrary, that not only that we were going to be open, we were going to be open free to the public, because we felt that this was a time to discuss and debate and to bring people together. And it was actually pretty, and we actually were not so directly involved as voices, to your point. It was more about giving people an opportunity. And it was a lot of artists of different ages. And the other thing I just wanted to add to the conversation, I think is really important to think about, is that, and it goes to what you were saying, Timothy, about how different audiences are responding and how you're perceived, and how in the last 6 months alone, we think differently, not only about what we do, but about the way things are going to be taken and how they mean. And I'm finding increasingly, and I don't know how much this is personal, but I think there's a real generational divide. And I think that was one of the questions that did come up in the Danish Schutz. There are a group of younger people who are pissed, and it's not just about race issues, it's a lot of things where there's a feeling of loss of control, and in response to that, and I understand it, but our position is that you have to be, you can't censor things, and it's critical for one culture to be able to comment on another culture. And these kinds of issues are not unlike the trigger warning questions that are coming up in colleges, and what you can talk about and what you can't. And I very much worry about kind of, not just freedom of expression, but kind of free speech issues.
In regard to what you said, Adam, I'm mindful of the fact that some of that pent-up demand or anxiety or need for expression is within our own institutions, because there are always generational shifts going on in museums, and the kind of conversations that we have today, let's say compared to 7 or 10 years ago, intramurally within the museum itself, are very, very different. And there's a push for more engagement, certainly from the younger members of our staff. I'd like to shift the conversation just a bit, and perhaps only momentarily, to another dimension of this, and that is this is not simply a curatorial collections issue. It's how we deal with the issue of access and engagement, yes. and in the social realm institutionally. And more of that's become part of the conversation we have. If you're going to be an outward-facing institution, and that's part of our strategic plan too, then it becomes a responsibility of all departments across the museum. And that's prompted a really, really interesting conversation that's gone well beyond education or membership and visitor services to even how...
You give an example, tell us a story about... I think of security, too. I mean, it's the really forward-facing staff. I mean, in our case, it's admissions, it's security, it's training people. We did this to take over what we fondly now call the Breuer Building. There was a real push for visitor engagement because we could do it with the small staff who was going to be interfacing. But the client services, and they're the first people the visitors meet, right?
And what's happened at the museum, among other things, is that membership and visitor services now is joined at the hip with security, in terms of how to think about engaging the visitor and the visitor experience. But it's also led to structural change in Philadelphia, and I suspect in many other institutions, where now our education department is organized in an entirely different way, and we have a department of community access and engagement that does some of this work, but not all of it, but is a voice for it within the institution. And let me just say finally, and offer this up as something we should talk about. In terms of interventions or interpretation and giving a platform for different voices, the digital has completely upended things as far as I'm concerned, and it offers so much opportunity that we simply didn't have before for multiplying and enriching that conversation.
Okay, when you're big on that, lots of new digital platforms, and a real revolution has gone on in Minneapolis since you got there.
I like to think that, thank you.
No, but you could give some good examples of how either social media or you have a storytelling project that's really neat.
We do, yeah. So, thinking about the ways, just as you said so well, Timothy, that digital can amplify the messages that we're already talking about. So whether it is through social media, through we have a digital storytelling platform in the galleries with iPads all over the place where people can take a deeper dive and usually sort of see video. So it could be, again, somebody who's of Native American heritage talking about the weaving tradition in their family. So you can look at the beautiful masterpiece in the case, but actually just sit down then and hear from the artists and from their culture. So it offers that opportunity. We also have thanks to funding from 3M, an annual technology prize that we do with the idea that we want to have lots of habitual technology in the galleries. Again, the iPads, the social media, information you can find on your phone. But we also want to be sort of pushing the edge and, but not investing in it permanently. So just trying things out. And so we have this digital technology prize that allows us to do some real experiments with the ways that people can engage in the galleries. Yeah.
Richard, do you want to add anything socially?
Maybe a little bit of vinegar. So
okay, no, that's good.
I'm in favor of all these experiments. I'm also in favor of utterly ignorant people having a good time in the museum. So I think we have to be open to the fact that I have no context, I don't know who that is, but it's making me dream to do something. And that's a very important role that we have. So we have to allow for misinterpretation or creative whatever and leave people alone to some degree because it's meant to be a dream palace also.
You know, it's interesting though, I mean, the whole thing of the digital, because I didn't want to go back to the Danish Schutz thing, but it's very interesting how the response to that painting of Emmett Till was so taken out of context because the majority of people who saw that painting didn't see the show, didn't even necessarily know the work, and also, too, then that the demands both outside and within the institution were to respond very quickly to it. And I found that, we have to understand that works on the wall no longer exist as part of an exhibition in the same way because things go out individually into the world. It used to be you'd come in, you'd see the whole exhibition, you'd have to understand whatever it is you're seeing through the exhibition, even if you really didn't look at the paintings. At least you'd see that there were 3 soldiers on the wall, and you would know that it was one of 3 soldiers on the wall. Now, you have no idea. And the demand for us to respond very quickly, and I'm actually very hesitant to do that, because I had a lot of people on my staff said, you're not responding quickly enough, we're not getting out, we're not getting in front. And I think we're in a culture that is not, and this goes sort of back to what you're saying, Richard, in a way, it's part of what museums is about is reflection and taking some time to think about it. Now, I'm not suggesting one waits weeks or months to respond to important issues, but I also think part of what we're about is pulling back a bit and giving enough time to have a thoughtful response. Anybody can push a button really, really quickly. In fact, most of the buttons that are being pushed today, I have to say, are not very interesting responses.
And you're saying, too, I'll interrupt and say, but you're also looking for the response to come from the visitors instead of, there's this, back to what I was, there's this outward, we have to respond, but if we step back,
but we also have to provide the context in a way. For example, what we did is 2 weeks after the whole Dana Schuetz discussion about the Emmett Till painting came up, we had a forum, a 2-hour forum for free on a Sunday night. It was actually not organized by us, but it was organized by a group that focuses on issues about race and culture. And we participated, but it became a forum for discussion. And it was a very intense discussion. But we had to have the time to frame that discussion in a way so that it wasn't just people coming in. I mean, I feel like we're in the 60s all over again. I really do. We had a dinner at the museum the other night, and people got up and stood up and started, speak. I mean, totally. It's in some ways exciting, and some ways actually, a positive thing. But it's very unnerving too.
I often say to our board that there's no playbook for how you respond to all of these things. I mean, every day I go home and there's something new in the news that, rocks us to our core, and there, isn't a playbook. And I've had to have 3 sort of emergency meetings with our staff since the election. And as you said to me, they're very upset, and they really, and it's not about whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It's about our values and all of the things that we stand for. And so sort of trying to figure out, and a couple of times I've said to my staff, I don't know either. I'm vulnerable here. We're all figuring this out together because there is no playbook. I want to ask before we have just a few more minutes, and I'd love to give you each an opportunity for sort of closing remarks, anything you wanted to say today that you haven't yet. But I'm also, we're talking about your museums, or our museums. But is there another museum that you look to, or another practice that inspires any of you that's being done anywhere in the world? Or, we all meet together to try to learn from each other. You have a project going on, right, about, just trying to get the language straight so that we can all learn from each other. But I think the inspiration that comes even from something like this today, how are you doing it? How are you doing it? How are you grappling with it? Makes it a little bit easier to explain to a board or to explain to curators, look what they did at the Whitney and it worked really well, or look what they're doing at the Guggenheim.
I'd say, looking at the 20th and 21st century, we look at Tate.
Do you?
Yeah.
And what are you looking at Tate for?
A willingness to experiment and a voice that's quite unified, factual, and friendly all at the same time.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to admit, if you want social change, that institution's done more for London than anything else that's happened there in the last 100 years, probably.
Yeah. By being a little disruptive, too, right?
And being highly attractive.
And highly attractive.
I think in my case, it's looking at a lot of parts of institutions and not any single one, and which I'm sure is the case of all of us. But I have to say, Kaywin and I had a conversation just before coming in, and one of the most radical things, and it works really well, where Kaywin was saying we have now over 1 million visitors a year at the Minneapolis Institute. It's, as far as I know, only one of 2 free museums that's not part of the Smithsonian on a large scale to the public. And I still think one of the most radical things that could be done, would that we could afford it, and most of us can't, to be open free to the public. So people could participate in the daily life of the museum where they don't have to feel like it's a special occasion and then you have to have 2 hours. Kaywin was saying, it's great that somebody can just come for half an hour. And, we have free hours, and, and the Met provides that access, which is a little bit more complicated for other reasons, and most institutions do. But I still think access, the most fundamental access, is that you could walk in the door and spend 10 minutes and not feel like you have to get ready for a field trip or get dressed up with your parents or, block out half a day because you're going to spend $25 to go to a museum.
That also, I'm reminded by, I can't remember who I was talking to, but it was the most kind of simple question of, who's the biggest competitor for the Met? And you want to say MoMA, but the answer isn't MoMA, the answer is Netflix. The answer is that kind of what's called the mind share of if you have $100 in a family and you've got a Saturday and it's going to take effort, what are you going to spend that money on? What are you going to spend that effort on? Choices, and what can you engage with your kids or your loved ones or your partner or whatever on? What are you going to do? And then how much, how do we even begin to compete with that choice? Being free would be one of them, sort of free, doesn't cost anything, but then.
So, two things. One is that I'm mindful of there's a lot that goes on that we don't see until it pops up above the waterline. But the institutions I admire most, and I can take Adam's point to heart that you choose bits and pieces from across the landscape, are those that are thinking in very new and different ways about what to do with their collections and are beginning to treat collections in a far more fluid manner. The Tate was ahead of the curve, I think, in that respect. But as I think about what MoMA is planning to do when it gets its new space in 2018 or 2019, and how it will represent its collections in a new and different, and again, very fluid way, I think that's very important. I say that because the one thing that I think is most challenging to all of us is we're making decisions in the long term, as well as responding to what's going on yesterday, the day before, last week, and to connect those two things and have them work together to achieve a certain goal, whether it's social engagement or audience development, I think is the real art to our jobs. And sometimes you get lucky. People came up to me last fall and said, how did you ever know to present a show on Mexican modernism when people are talking, 4 years ago, when people are today talking about building a wall between Mexico and the United States?
I love it. You had so much foresight, right?
It's an act of genius. And I said,
how did you know?
It's pretty much dumb luck, right? But there was clearly something in the air about that topic. And I don't know, none of us have a crystal ball, but prompting, choosing things that are a little bit out of your wheelhouse to do as exhibitions or to ask those questions about representing the collection that are the questions that are based on what you think is happening out there is really important for us to do.
I'm just thinking it's also a simple thing, but all 4 of your museums have beautiful outdoor space too as the weather changes. And so I think that's really important for people to for gathering and community gathering spaces. You have it on the Hudson, your plaza is always filled with people, Because we have good hot dogs. You have good hot dogs, you have ice cream. And I think of your plaza, and I've been to Bilbao, it's spectacular just to, you could walk around that building all day long and never go in. So places of engagement and the delight of an aggregating space.
Sometimes we have the Rocky Steps, so people.
Well, I was going to say I didn't want to.
And go down, and then last week, like the Wicked Witch of the West, we had the NFL draft drop on us out of the sky and block the museum for 4 days. So our civic spaces are really interesting, but they're used for a lot of different purposes.
Anything else? Any closing remarks from? Questions? Any questions?
Glad you shared the microphone.
Go ahead, yes?
Hi. Yeah, Rubadiri Victor, former co-director of the National Museum of Trinidad and Tobago. Right, so just a couple of statements probably more than anything else on the question of social action and relevance and all that. Well, I don't think all museums and galleries should be the same. So, I mean, I agree. But the Guggenheim, there's no obligation for museums to all inhabit the same head space. And that free speech should be the litmus test. That being said, I think the challenge, like it's probably as seen in the room, is the question of inclusion and those kinds of questions, which is the challenge, the integration of directors, curators, trustees, admins, staff, artists, and audience, which is challenges at the top of challenging privilege, basically, and inclusion based on merit. That there are thousands of people of merit, of all different populations and voices, whose ideas, spaces, memories need to be there. So I think it's about the museum being a place that is inhabited by the memory of people, and also the imagination and creativity of people, the people of the space. And to give an example, as the example of the rooms, right? But that was one room of upper middle class white family. And yes, there was inclusion of the voices, but as peripheral, marginal stuff of this room, which is the mainstream room. But there were also contingent rooms, the room of the teepee, the room of the slave cabin, the room of maroon communities, the room of reservations, that were all contingent to that room. And those are the various rooms that constitute the nation. And so the challenge is then, at every point in time, is challenging the mental space of privilege, and for inclusion. And then you would find, by the beautiful alchemy of such things, that all of a sudden audience and patronage and all those kinds of things expand, simply because it now is relevant. It connects, only connect. And I suppose, so, which answers all the questions of free speech, of the diversity of intent of each museum, that you can be all about art. You can also be about relevance, engagement, and all those kinds of things. But if the litmus test is free speech and relevance in that way, and inclusion is at the center of that, because for there to be free speech, then everyone's voice must be recognized, then all questions are answered. So I don't want to monopolize the mic, but yes, it is to say that much, right?
I would just, first of all, thank you, because I very much agree with you. And when we opened the new Whitney, we did an exhibition called America's Hard to See. And it was actually dedicated by Mrs. Obama. And Mrs. Obama said on the front steps of the museum, there are people in this neighborhood who would never even think that this is a place for them, that this is a place that they could enter. And part of that at first starts, I think, obviously with the staff and the boards of the museum, but it also starts fundamentally too with the collection. When people see themselves, and it goes to what you were talking about with the period rooms, when they start to see themselves in the museum and how they have affected culture, then it gives them a reason to want to be there, and it also gives them a reason to engage in a much more inclusive fashion. So
and it also gives the people who normally see themselves a larger idea of the world.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I see Linda's approaching, which means partly I think we're in a restaurant, right, that needs to turn into but any final remarks from our panelists before I want to thank you all for coming, but anything additionally from any of you? Thank you so much, and
thank you, Carrie.
Enjoy the show.